Now available in paperback and Kindle, Vampires Stalk the Darkness of the Eternal Night. Get your copy of Eternal Night in paperback and Kindle on Amazon.com. One of my viewers during my last live stream wanted to know what inspired me to write the vampire novel Eternal Night. And what inspired me to write the vampire novel Eternal Night was basically a live stream I was watching between comic artists Josh Howard and Brian Baugh, where they were talking about vampires, werewolves, and spirituality. Now, usually in my fantasy books like The Temptation of John Haynes and stories that I've written in the Isis series like Isis Night of the Vampires and Isis Bride of Dracula, I oftentimes approach these supernatural characters from a very spiritual perspective. And when I was listening to Josh and Brian talk about vampires and spirituality, this was what inspired me to further develop another one of the characters in the SJS Direct universe, Lilith Graves, and give us her story on how she became a vampire back in 1994. And I wanted to go and explore Lilith Graves' origin so that I could show the spiritual aspects as related to the undead, because oftentimes in most modern and contemporary vampire stories, they oftentimes omit all of the spiritual elements as related to supernatural characters like vampires. Usually, when you watch a show like a Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or you watch some of the more contemporary horror movies that revolve around vampires, they oftentimes try to approach things from an agnostic perspective, even though these supernatural characters started out with a spiritual foundation. And that spiritual foundation starts out in books like your Bram Stoker's Dracula, because if you go to Bram Stoker's Dracula, you will see that after Dracula's wife dies, he then renounces God and then makes a deal with the devil in order to gain immortality. And that's something that wasn't explored in most vampire stories, because most vampire stories don't really want to explore the more demonic aspects of the vampire. And the only last time I saw somebody do that was in Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, where they explored the more demonic aspects of the vampire. So with Eternal Night, I wanted to explore the more demonic aspects of the vampire, and I wanted to show how the vampire has a direct relationship to Lucifer, the devil, because this is the person who the Dracula got his powers from, and with Dracula being the lord of the vampires, this is where the core foundation for the spiritual aspect of the vampire begins, because the vampire, as I saw it, was a creature who pledged their loyalty to Satan, and this was a creature that wanted to go with Satan because they did not want to receive the gift of eternal life from Jesus Christ that was promised to people when they took God's gift of salvation. So when I was writing Eternal Night, I wanted to show that the vampire is in contrast to our spirituality, and our spirituality is as related to God is based on the promise of Jesus Christ, and that promise that is assured that when we take God to give our lives to Christ and take his gift of salvation, we are assured the gift of eternal life when we leave this plane of earth. And I wanted to show that the vampire, in contrast, does not want that gift of eternal life and does not believe in that promise. And the vampire, instead, what they believe is they want the guarantee of Satan, and Satan's guarantee is that if you join him, you will have your immortality in this world, and you will be able to live forever and stay eternally young if you support him and pledge your loyalty to him. Now, as I saw it with the vampire, this gift of eternal night, this was done to be a mockery of Jesus Christ and the Last Supper and the cup that he talked about. And this was done in as related to taking up that cup and being and drinking from the same cup that Jesus Christ took. So the vampire, what they want to do is make a mockery of Jesus, as I saw it, in drinking the blood, because in drinking the blood, which is considered to be the life, the vampire, what they're doing is mocking God by drinking this blood, and they're mocking him by saying that they're taking up this cup for the devil. So that's where I saw as related to the whole covenant between the vampire and the devil. This undead creature, what they want to do, yes, their body is between the states of life and death, and what they want to do is they need this blood of the living in order to stay alive, because the soul is always alive, but in the case of the undead, their body is frozen between the states of life and death, and they need to reconnect their souls, which have become disconnected from their bodies, to their bodies once they drink the blood. So the blood is the life that allows them to stay immortal in this world, and they want that immortality again because they want to remain immortal and forever young in this world. So I really wanted to, again, explore the spiritual aspects as related to the vampire, because they weren't really explored in most other vampire stories, where they always tried to make the vampire a sympathetic character. But in my story, I wanted to really show that the vampire was not a sympathetic character, but that the vampire was a predator. And this vampire and this group of vampires, they are predators who want to go out here and they want to be able to turn people into these undead, because they are looking for people to continue to follow Satan down that dark road. So that's what I wanted to do as related to my inspiration for Eternal Night, because just like my slogan, I was saying that those who refuse the gift of eternal life, they are condemned to wander in the darkness of eternal night. And as I was writing the story, I was thinking about what it would be like to be forever separated from God, and what it would mean to be wandering in that darkness. Because when I would read the Bible and I would think about things like as related to our relationship with God, I was thinking about what it would be to be separated from God. And these vampires, these are beings that willfully and intentionally, in most cases, want to be forever separated from God, and they don't want a relationship with God. These are beings that, like Dracula, their lord, has rejected God, and they want to have their paradise here on earth, but there is no real paradise here on earth. Really, they're in a hell on earth, and that's because these are beings that have been given over to their sin nature. And that's why I have on the dedication page of Eternal Night, Romans verse chapter 1:28, where Jesus talks about those beings that go out here and they he talks about it in Romans verse 1:28, where he says, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. And what is not convenient is not taking God's gift of salvation. And these beings did not want to retain God in their knowledge. So when I was thinking about the vampire, I thought about a creature that did not want to know God, did not want to have a relationship with God, and did not want anything to do with God. And they wanted to do what benefited them. They were all about this world, and they were caught up in their sin nature and how reprobate they are. And these are beings that have a reprobate mind, and they're given over to a complete sin nature. So I was exploring all of those aspects as related to the vampire, because I really wanted to show how this vampire was a demon, and how these are people who are basically have their souls corrupted by demons. And I also wanted to show in Eternal Night that struggle between the forces of the Most High Living God and the devil, and the struggle for everybody's soul. And that's where the Lilith Graves character comes in, because the Lilith Graves character, she was a pastor's daughter. She was a part of the church, and this woman, she doesn't believe in God because she's caught up in the world, and she sees the world and sees everything in it, and then she sees the hypocrisy of those who are in the church, and this makes her not want to believe in the Most High Living God, and she doesn't appreciate learning about the Most High Living God. She sits there and she's thinking, oh, it's all about these people, not understanding that God is always there for us, and it's not about what other people believe, it's about our own personal experience with the living God. So Lilith really does not believe in God because she's, as I saw it, was too close to religion. And because she was so close to religion, she didn't really know anything about God. She was in the church, but she wasn't having a relationship with God all of her own. And because she didn't believe in God, what happened was she was left spiritually open and spiritually vulnerable. And this is something that happens to a lot of pastors' sons and pastors' daughters, from what I have read and I have heard. And I even had one of my viewers tell me that the pastor's son and the pastor's daughter, they often become very wayward, and they're out because they look at the world and they see the world and what it really tempts them, and they think everything is okay with the world because they are so close up on the church and religion that they can't see God. And the Lilith character, she's really caught up in the world, and she wants to be a part of the world, and she doesn't know about the dark forces spiritually that are out there. So she's very vulnerable to spiritual attack, and that's what happens to the Lilith character in Eternal Night that leads to her becoming an undead. Her lack of faith in God leads to her winding up being seduced by this Malice character, this goth musician, and he turns her into an undead, and she winds up becoming this monster. And it's when she becomes this monster that she starts to really appreciate the lessons that her father taught her as related to spirituality, because she starts to see herself turning into this monster, and she starts to see herself starting to become consumed with this sin nature. Now, I really wanted to make that point because about being spiritually vulnerable, because a lot of people, they don't understand how vulnerable you are to spiritual attack if you don't have a spiritual education, or you're like Lilith, who takes her spiritual education for granted. Because the Lilith character, she took her spiritual education for granted, and because she took her spiritual education for granted, she wasn't able to receive God's gift of salvation, or the seal like Matilda had that would protect her from these creatures like the Malice character. So the Lilith character, I really wanted to show again about spiritual vulnerability and spiritual attack, and I really wanted to show how you can be vulnerable to attack from these spiritual forces and principalities of darkness, and how they can transform you. I also, with the Lilith character, with her name, wanted to make a commentary as related to something I had heard about in the Talmud. The Lilith character has that name because I was thinking about what they said about
Lilith being the first wife of Adam, and how the Lilith was belligerent and defiant, and how she refused to submit to Adam's authority. And this is why she was cast out into darkness. So I wanted to make a commentary on that part of the Talmud with the Lilith Graves character in her name. And I also wanted to do that with the Adam character in the story. Now, the Adam character is the first man she ever experienced, and she doesn't want anything to do with Adam. But what happens with Lilith is, because she walks away from the church, she winds up out into the darkness, and this is how she winds up becoming one of these undead, because she winds up not wanting to submit to God and not wanting to submit to a man, and this leads to her becoming this undead monster. And these were all things that were inspirations for the character of Lilith Graves. And another inspiration for the Lilith Graves character was the late singer Aaliyah. Now, the late singer Aaliyah, I got inspired as related to the Lilith Graves character because she died so young. And the Lilith Graves character, she loses her life spiritually so young. And that's what inspired me with Aaliyah as related to her appearance, because Aaliyah lost everything before she could actually actualize her potential. I mean, I think she died at 21 or 22, and the Lilith Graves character is 23. She's just graduated from NYU with a master's degree, and I wanted to make the point that, this woman, she lost her life so young because she took not only her physical life for granted, she also took her spiritual life for granted. And that was one of the things that I wanted to, that was important to me in the story as related to the themes of Eternal Night, was not only just making it a vampire story, but making it a story about, our spiritual life, because our life here on earth is not that long. And when you think about it in the context of things, and when you think about, the context of life, it's here 1 minute, the next is gone. But what happens with our eternal life is forever. And we take our spiritual life for granted here on earth. A lot of us take it for granted. And I wanted to make a commentary on that in Eternal Night, that, you can't take your spiritual life for granted. I mean, when I was writing this story, I thought a lot about what my mother had taught me over the years, because she taught me about the Bible ever since I was about 4 or 5 years old. And I hadn't really thought too much about those lessons until I really started writing this novel, and I started thinking about what it would be like to be forever separated from God. And I thought about what it would be like to be forever separated from God with this Lilith character, because because she was spiritually vulnerable, she was vulnerable to attack by this Malice character, and this Malice character took her on the road to darkness, and she wound up becoming spiritually lost, and she wound up wandering in this darkness, and wound up in this world where she found out that these vampires, these predators, these demons, what they do is they suck you into their world. And I also wanted to do some things psychologically, because I thought about, your energy vampires, your emotional vampires, these people who just come into your life and they suck all the energy out of you. They suck all the life out of you. And I wanted to explore the whole idea of this vampire, Malice, he's not just a guy who sucks blood, he sucks life out of people like Lilith, by taking advantage of them, twisting their dreams and desires, and then using them to further enrich himself at their expense. And in his eyes, most people are food and fodder for his hedonistic pleasures. And that's another thing that really was not explored in most vampire stories, is how these vampires oftentimes, they don't see people as human beings. They see them as fodder and for their hedonistic pleasures, because these creatures, they're having their paradise here on earth, and as part of their paradise, they get pleasure out of our misery. So a lot of these people, they think that these vampires, they think that they're better than human beings because they've bought into the lies that the devil has told them about their newfound undead status. And I again, that's all part of the spirituality, because the vampire is caught up in the devil and is caught up in the lies of the devil. And that's another revelation that comes later in the book for Lilith, in the book in Eternal Night. And there were a lot of inspirations and influences in Eternal Night, also from horror movies. The reason why Lilith is bit on the thigh comes from the Jim Carrey, Lauren Hutton movie Once Bitten, and the way Lilith drinks blood in the movie, not the movie, the book, in a chapter with the diner. That comes from a vampire movie I saw a long time ago on Channel 11. It was about this guy who he goes to the supermarket and he buys pig's blood in a cup in order to sustain himself. There were a whole lot of horror movies that I drew inspiration from for Eternal Night, but these were a lot of 80s horror movies, and the 80s horror movies, they have these things in them. They're a bit more humorous than your 50s horror movies, which had a bit more psychology, or your 60s horror movies, which had a bit more of a schlocky feel, like those old Hammer horror movies. And I drew from a lot of 80s horror for a lot of scenes in Eternal Night, and I also got a little inspired from Interview with the Vampire in some aspects, and I also drew inspiration from goth music for some scenes in Eternal Night. Now, there was a couple of songs from London After Midnight that inspired things like Revolution, I think it's the name of the song, and there were a couple of London After Midnight songs that also inspired some scenes in Eternal Night. And I really wanted this to be a rich and complex vampire story that really took you into the vampire lore, put some fresh takes on the vampire lore, gave you some understanding to why these vampires drink blood. And that was one of the things that I really wanted to explore as related to these vampires, that they're not just drinking blood for the sake of drinking blood, that this drinking of blood has something to do with the making a mockery of the covenant of God that was made between men and God with the Last Supper. And it was also wanted to show how the devil was making mockery of God with this blood drinking, because this blood drinking is about them having their eternal life here on earth at the expense of humanity, and them having their pleasures by promoting their debauchery and deviancy as just the way that they live. And as Lilith learns more and more about that depravity, she becomes more and more disgusted by it, because she, again, has not really come to appreciate what a spiritual education is. She's all about her master's degree and the NYU, and I was making a commentary there about, those 90s single, successful, well-educated black women, and how they were out here and how they were vulnerable because they did not want to submit to the black man that God provided for them, and how this leads to them being vulnerable to being taken by predators and then transformed into a monster. So there was a lot of different elements and different things that inspired Eternal Night, but all of that didn't start until I really watched Josh Howard and Brian Baugh talking about vampires and spirituality, because they really inspired me to take this type of story to another level. Because in the past, I did this type of story with the temptation of John Haynes, with Esteem being the demon and John Haynes being the follower of Christ, and him being the example that inspired her to walk away from the devil. And then with stories like Night of the Vampires and Bride of Dracula, I really explored the vampires and spirituality to that point, and with Escape from Transylvania, I built further upon the world. But I wanted to have a foundation that really showed readers where everything came from as related to the vampire lore in the SJS Direct universe, and I really wanted to show everybody how vampirism works in the SJS Direct universe, and I wanted to show that in the SJS Direct universe, vampirism has a deep connection to spirituality, and it has a deep connection to these demons who want to make mockery of God, and it's something that isn't, as I saw it, explored regularly in most vampire books, and I really wanted to go out of my way to explore these vampires and show you why these creatures are demons, why these creatures are predators, and why these creatures are dangerous to humanity, because these creatures, what they want to do is take you away from God, and they want to have you wandering in darkness with them, and they want to use you for food and just get your blood, or they want to go out here and take your soul straight to hell. And what they also want to do is they want to use people to further advance themselves. And what's really sad is I want to show that these vampires, they were at the bottom of the demon world, and they were at the bottom of the demon kingdom, but they are celebrated and romanticized. But I wanted to show where they would stand in the reality as related to wandering in that darkness known as the eternal night. Now, if you want to learn more about Lilith's story and you want to explore all of the aspects I talked about as related to vampires and the undead, you can pick up my book, Eternal Night, on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. And for a limited time, it's going to be on Kindle Unlimited. So if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read Eternal Night for free. And if you want to see me make more videos like this and publish more books like Eternal Night, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.